Hi everybody, welcome back to English 116, and this is for our class for Monday, the 15th. And as you can see in the notes below, I wanted to talk a little bit about paper topics because I know you've probably been curious. But before I get into paper topics, you'll see that our previous classes are in our class sessions folder. As I had indicated, I retire each week, and then the current week is what you can see on Moodle. So last week is in the past class sessions folder, and this week is what you can see in Moodle. And if you were to go to our syllabus and other documents folder, what you will find is the handout for our first paper. And I always recommend that you take a paper copy, that you take a print copy so that you've got it in front of you. So I wanted to talk a little bit about that, even though your first paper isn't going to be due until midway through the semester. And paper number one, which is that first paper, is a critical paper. In other words, you shouldn't be consulting outside resources. It should be based on your interpretations and your learning and understanding from the class. The paper length, approximately 4 to 5 pages, but as long or as short as it needs to be to support your thesis, which is the position that you are defending in your paper. And more on that in a moment. So what I've done is I've created 4 topics, and you can choose any one of those 4, only one, or you can write on your own topic as long as you get the topic approved by me, and you have to address one of the texts that we are reading or watching in class. And in terms of the text, I consider film as much of a text as any other text. So the options you have are from the fiction section. You can see that they're listed on the handout. Citizen Kane, which is how we are beginning the semester as we are transferring over from the idea or transitioning over from the idea of what is literature and how to read it and write about it, and the same about film, to actually seeing a film and interpreting it and reading some literature and interpreting that. The short stories, A Sorrowful Woman, The Story of an Hour, A Rose for Emily, Young Goodman Brown, Soldier's Home, Battle Royal, or Popular Mechanics. In last class, I have provided you with links where you can find those online, but of course, the textbook has all of those, and if the textbook didn't have that, then I would be providing you a link for it. So your 4 options, because this is basically what we've been talking about thus far. Number 1, identify a text from the fiction section that you think should be included in the literary canon, detailing the reasons why. Or identify a text from the fiction section you think should not be included in the literary canon, detailing the reasons why. So as you know, we were talking a little bit about the literary canon last class, those works that are considered by scholars and critics worth academic study. We talked about some of the criteria associated with that. There's usually depth, there's usually complexity, it's usually creative and unique. It oftentimes has some sort of statement or message from the author. Not that we have to agree with the author's statement or message. It is written not just primarily for profit motive. So that said, we'll be talking a little bit more about canon as the semester progresses. But as you know, Citizen Kane is considered to be part of the cinematic canon. In fact, it's considered to be perhaps the best movie ever made, which we will debate as the semester progresses. And note that in these 2 questions and the 2 that'll follow as possibilities for your paper, there are no right or wrong answers. So you could literally write 2 papers that contradict one another, and they could equally be strong enough to earn an A, depending on the evidence and the details that you use. I oftentimes liken it to an attorney. A good attorney can argue either side of a case, whether it be prosecution or defense. Now, certainly, one side of the case might have more evidence than another, but a good attorney knows how to package the evidence so that it's most convincing. And then it's up to the judge and jury and so forth to make decisions. which is why so many people who are thinking about law, and this was my story actually, become English majors, because you learn how to debate positions. And the position you take in your paper may not necessarily even be a position you believe in, but what's important is the argumentation that you utilize. But if you didn't want to talk about the literary canon, you could talk about contemporary relevance. Now, contemporary relevance is oftentimes an element associated with canon. It's something that has timeless and universal themes. But if you wanted to focus just on contemporary relevance, then you've got question 3, identify a text from the fiction section you think has the most contemporary relevance in our society, detailing the reasons why. Or identify a text from the fiction section you think has the least contemporary relevance in our society, detailing the reasons why. Regardless of the topics you choose, provide textual evidence and details to support your argument. So that's what's going to be key, is that you are referencing the text itself. And at the bottom of this handout, I've got a question or a statement that says, I've got both really. A good question to ask yourself when you're writing a paper or reading someone else's writing is, quote, have I, or has the author, said this as clearly, concisely, believably, or gracefully as possible? And notice I use quotation marks to indicate what language was not mine. I use square brackets to indicate when I was inserting my own language into a quote. At the ending of the quote, I have parentheses that indicate the author's last name and page number of that quote. Hopefully this sounds familiar, something you would have talked about in English 101 or Composition 1 about documentation for writing, particularly for the humanities. And it's the languages, specifically we're talking about Modern Language Association is the professional organization that's come up with these rules. But these are rules that we'll talk about as the semester progresses as well, just not in the level of depth that you would in a Composition 1 class. So these are your 4 options, and I know that this is a rather tall order to say something as clearly, concisely, believably, or gracefully as possible. As I had a very wise professor in college once say, that a piece of writing is never done. You just have to hand it in at some point. And it's true, you can spend a lifetime developing it, but you don't have a lifetime. You've got about approximately midway through the semester. But as I had indicated, my deadlines are rolling deadlines. So I chose midway through the semester because ultimately by that point we would have completed the fiction section. And certainly by midway through the semester, it would be a good idea for you to have some feedback in terms of your writing. But certainly you can hand in your paper earlier once I distribute the topics, in other words, today. I recommend that you not submit in a paper until after we've talked about the text that you are writing about, because you will probably learn something in class about that particular text. And that said, you can also submit in a paper after the fact, after the midpoint of the semester, but let me know what's going on at that point, because I'm getting a little bit anxious if we've gone halfway through the semester and you haven't submitted in a paper. So you can just sort of keep this in the back of your mind as we are transitioning from our introductory material about what is literature and what is film and how do we read it and how do we write about it, and actually watch Citizen Kane, our first film, and then read The Story of an Hour, A Rose for Emily, Young Goodman Brown, Soldier's Home, Battle Royal, and Popular Mechanics. So the textbook, and I know that different people are using different editions of the book, so if it turns out that you're not using the edition that is the most recent edition, which is what our syllabus lists, the page numbers will be different. However, you should be able to find the same material going into the either table of contents, so you can look up the sections, or you can also go into the index in the back. And writing about literature, and sometimes the headings might be slightly different. They might be differently rephrased, but writing about literature, the textbook gives you a series of questions to ask yourself about plot. That's probably the most important piece when you're reading a piece of writing, at least initially. What happened? But that's only the beginning. What's more important is, why did those things happen? Or as I say, that's the difference between the junior high school book report showing that you know what happened and the college paper examining why, and the whys can be quite complex. But if you haven't read the text or seen the film, then you really can't talk about plot. And then you can move on beyond plot and ask yourself, is this plot formulaic? Is it predictable? Is it creative? Why or why not? Is the story told in chronological order? Why or why not? And then think about the characters. Who are the characters? Why are they there? Are they developed and complex? Are they more simplistic or stereotypical? And thinking about the setting, where the story takes place, and how would the story be different if the setting took place someplace else? And could the setting be perhaps symbolic? Could it be representational? Thinking about symbolism, usually what we do is we take something that's concrete to suggest or represent something that is not concrete, such as an emotion. For instance, a flag is a concrete thing that can represent the emotion of patriotism. And you might say that's an obvious symbol. Now, keep in mind that you weren't born knowing this. Obviously, somebody taught it to you. You probably don't remember who. Authors will oftentimes use symbols that are not as obvious, that are a little bit more creative and unique, so we're going to have to interpret that. Theme. What is the message, or I should say themes? What are the messages that are in the text? The style. What kind of writing is used? Is it formal? Is it informal? How creative is it? Do different characters use different language, and if so, why? Tone. The feeling of the story. Is it happy? Is it sad? Perhaps it's a bit of both. Irony, when you get the exact opposite of something that you expected, but with a twist. It's known as frisson in French. I believe the example you're given in the textbook is when a firehouse burns down, because this is unexpected and also has a twist, because firehouses house fire personnel who put out fires, and now their own building has been destroyed by a fire. Best example I can give is from popular culture, Twilight Zone, actually, 1950s television show that had some of the best short story writers of the day, by the way. The episode entitled Time Enough at Last. Perhaps you've seen it. It's about a kind of henpecked husband and employee who works at a bank. He basically just wants to read, but he's not allowed to read at work, and he's certainly not allowed to read at home. His wife nags him to do chores, and his boss nags him to pay attention to his tasks at work. And one day it turns out that he locks himself accidentally in the bank vault. Everyone has gone home. Obviously, this is pre-cell phone time, so we do need to suspend some disbelief here that after he's locked himself in the vault, that was enough to protect him so he survives the subsequent nuclear blast that destroys all of civilization around him. And as he crawls out the rubble, at first he's horrified at the destruction. And then he's rather pleased and realizes he finally isn't going to be bothered by his wife or boss, and that he can do what he wants to do, which is read. Again, if you can suspend some disbelief, he manages to crawl his way to the ruins of a library. The books are still intact, and he gathers all of the books so that he can read, which is what he wants to do. And as he lowers to his face to look down at the books, his glasses slide off of his face. These are very thick Coca-Cola kind of glasses that would have been made out of glass, considering the time period, not plastic. And the glasses slide off his face, fall to the ground, and shatter. So basically, now he has time enough at last to read, but he can't see. And that's one of the best examples I can think of in terms of irony. And critical strategies about reading. We had talked a little bit about this last class, that biographical critics will focus on biography and psychological critics will focus on psychology. Not that I want you to determine how you're going to read every single piece of literature through a particular literary perspective. Let the literature make the decision for you. I kind of liken it to being a general practitioner as opposed to a medical specialist. That as useful as medical specialists are, sometimes they're so hyper-focused on their specialty They miss what's most obvious that a general practitioner would find. And I think it's the same with literature. So certainly you can consider yourself to be something like a reader response critic, but the idea is that not necessarily every text lends itself to that particular reading. And it's the same with the list of questions in our textbook about how to write about literature. I don't expect you just to do a checklist of each question and answering it. Mix and match and answer the questions that seem to have relevance for the particular piece you're reading. And in fact, the textbook will even give you a sample paper in progress, and we'll talk about the importance of doing it in stages, in pieces, not doing it at the last minute in one sitting, where usually you have a much poorer product. And the way to do it is, rather than try to write the perfect first sentence, is to generate ideas first and then organize those ideas in the order in which you think you might like to discuss them. And then finally develop some rough sentences around them, and then you can think about editing and polishing. How to generate ideas, whether you journal, it's just a kind of diary, but rather than writing about your personal life, you're writing about the readings. Or you're brainstorming any idea that comes into your mind. And the greatness about this is that this is just for your own eyes. So it doesn't have to be a good idea, and it doesn't necessarily have to be something that you even utilize over the course of the semester. Then you can draft, then you can edit, and then finally you can submit. But as I said, we'll talk about this as the semester progresses. So, writing about fiction, poetry, and drama, the idea of first reading, then discussion, then writing. And I had recommended 3 readings, or in terms of film, 3 viewings. The first being for plot, what's happening. The second for analysis, why is it happening? And the third to refresh your memory before you begin to write about it or talk about it. Now, I understand it may not be possible for you to do 3 readings or 3 viewings, but this is what's ideal. And there isn't any reason to stop at 3. You could stop at 30 or 300. Obviously, the more you do it, the more detailed your observations are going to be. But don't expect that with just a first viewing or reading that you're going to be catching everything. And the idea behind annotating, taking notes in your text. So if you've got a paper version of your text, there's a reason why we've got those thick, or wide, I should say, margins, because those are places where you can write notes. So you're paying for that because it's paper, obviously. A place to also put your reflections and your questions, because we have notoriously poor memories. So chances are, if you don't write it out, you won't remember. And also the idea of just the general elements of a paper where you have a topic, and I've provided you with topics, but you need to come up with a thesis, the specific position, where you offer textual evidence, evidence from the text, quotation and paraphrase, and you are also in the process of writing, organizing, drafting, quoting, revising, and editing. But as I said, we'll talk about this more in depth as the semester progresses. I've also put in our syllabus and other documents folder a handout, and you can see that this is in the 5th section, the notes below. So you can either access the handout in our folder, but it also is a web link, and it's specifically devoted to how to write about film. And the good news is that it's similar to writing about written text. That there are, however, different kinds of approaches, and some are more academic than others. You're probably most familiar in terms of film with the movie review, where someone is recommending that you watch or not watch a particular film. That's usually not what we do in an academic situation. Instead, we do, as I talked about earlier, the critical essay, that basically the writer is providing key details and themes. You don't need to go into a lengthy summary. The assumption is that the reader is already familiar, or the viewer is already familiar with the text that you are discussing. And you can focus in a lot of different ways. Perhaps you can focus on some of the formal elements, such as structure or style, or perhaps you want to ask what's the most interesting and significant formal element of the particular film or even just a particular scene, and how lighting and sound and editing and cinematography contribute to that. And again, I'm getting ahead of myself a little bit because we haven't even watched film, but we will very soon. And you can also look at genre, the particular kind of film that you are watching, and what is the pattern, and again, of lighting, editing, cinematography, things of that nature. Um, Things like themes and characterization, the issues that you would think about when you are reading a piece of fiction. Does that conform to or does it diverge from a genre? Thinking about the historical period of the film or the time in which a text was written is going to be very important because that will inform how the story was developed. Do you see that it conforms to particular expectations or does it deviate from it? And what are the historical events that are depicted in the film, and what is the historical background of the time period of the film? And those, again, are questions you can ask yourself with written text. Or you can talk about the film's technology, the idea of color versus black and white, um, and the reception even of a film by a particular audience. So this is much more theoretical. You can even do a kind of theoretic essay where, you're looking at national cinema or one of the theoretical forms of film. Perhaps you're looking at a particular director's style. So things can get rather complex. Even talking about ideology, so we were talking about things like post-colonial studies, or viewing film from or text from a global perspective, or viewing film from a classic Hollywood perspective, how classical film formulas dominate and distort, or perhaps looking at gender studies with a particular film. So there are similarities, but there are also differences because film is a visual media in the way that text is not. So what I wanted us to do today was to get a little bit of background about Citizen Kane. You can see that in the notes below. After this handout, I have a picture that you might recognize. The actor is of Jack Nicholson, and the film is from The Shining, a film that came out in the 1970s, or was it 1980? But nevertheless, it was based on a Stephen King novel, and I wanted to show you this picture just to emphasize the importance of visual analysis, something that you might miss on a first view or perhaps even a third view. The tie that the actor is wearing, which is green, but you can also see that it's got a pattern in it. And that pattern is very deliberate in the picture that we can see below because it anticipates patterns that will be important in the film. It's a hedge maze, and you can see the picture of the actor looking at a model of the hedge maze, and then we've got a close-up of the hedge maze that plays a very important part in the film. And again, you might miss this, but the director, Stanley Kubrick, is a very meticulous and a very deliberate director, so he would have done this purposefully. Even if he didn't do it purposefully, there's enough evidence in there to indicate that that tie anticipates, foreshadows, if you will, the hedge maze that we are going to be reading about over, or watching in this case with the film, over the course of the film. So, Citizen Kane is the first film that we are going to be watching, and it's an old film, and you might be wondering, why would we spend our times with a film from this time period? Citizen Kane is usually identified as one of the best films ever made, if not the best film ever made. It usually appears in the top 10 of the best film lists, and yes, I understand that's somewhat subjective. And I must say that I saw Citizen Kane initially when I was a freshman in college, and I honestly was not terribly impressed. And it was because I really didn't understand the film and why it was so important. And it's only after the fact that I have realized that it truly is a masterpiece. for its time and for our time, because film in our period has been directly influenced by the techniques that were developed in Citizen Kane, as we will see. Because we will watch Citizen Kane twice. First, we will watch it as a film. That's what we're doing next class. And then we will watch it with commentary by noted critic, by a noted film critic. And whether or not you agree or disagree with the critics' perspectives, I think you'll be able to at least appreciate the idea of why Citizen Kane is considered to be so important in cinematic studies. The critic is Roger Ebert, so you may be familiar with him. He's no longer with us, unfortunately. So why is Citizen Kane so important? And you gotta love YouTube, because YouTube gives a documentary, or YouTube has a documentary that talks a little bit about the importance of Citizen Kane. And again, it merely scratches the surface, and I've identified about 40 minutes or so for you to watch, and you can see this in the notes below in the 6th section, the battle over Citizen Kane. And then at the ending of that, I've put a link to the entire documentary if it turns out you want to see the entire documentary. And the links I wanted you to see, the first is about 1939, so it gives you an idea of the time and place of the period. And then it talks a little bit about the man that Citizen Kane is based on, William Randolph Hearst, who was a media mogul at the time. Modern day parallels, perhaps the best I can come up with is something like an Elon Musk. Very powerful, very rich, and dabbled in politics. At the time, in the 1940s, he owned multiple media organizations, and Citizen Kane is loosely based on him. And we learned a little bit about the director, the co-writer, and the lead actor in Citizen Kane, who is Orson Welles. And he had achieved fame through his radio programs in the 30s, specifically A War of the Worlds television broadcasts, where basically individuals who tuned in late, and he had counted on many people doing that, thought that the broadcast was real. He took the fictionalized story of War of the Worlds by H.G. Wells, no relation between the two Welleses, and he made it into a news broadcast that sounded so realistic that people panicked. Phone lines were jammed, and places of worship were filled, traffic jams occurred, and there were even reports of suicide. It's something that I talk about in my media class. But basically, it led to Wells speaking to Congress, and laws being enacted that when radio programs or any kind of media program is broadcast, that there needs to be a deliberate attempt to show and let the viewer know that what they are seeing is a fictionalized broadcast. So they'll oftentimes announce their call letters, for instance, multiple times, and that was because of this incident. Well, what this led to, and Orson Welles was very young, in his early 20s, it could have led to the ending of Orson Welles' career, but instead it led to a film contract. Keep in mind, these are the early days of film, where Orson Welles had practically complete and total control, which was unheard of at the time. And then what we will see is that Orson Welles ended up teaming up with a film writer. His name was Mankiewicz, who was friends with a very powerful person, the mistress of William Randolph Hearst. And William Randolph Hearst was very open about having a mistress and was powerful enough to openly live with her without any kind of repercussions. And because he knew the mistress, he was invited. Her name is Marion Davis. Mankiewicz was invited to the parties at the house, and Mankiewicz took copious notes, and Mankiewicz put together a screenplay of what he saw, and with Orson Welles' help, they changed a few of the details and basically created Citizen Kane. Occasionally, Orson Welles put in elements of his own life story, but it was pretty obvious to anybody who saw the film that it was loosely, or maybe not so loosely, based on William Randolph Hearst. And it was not a flattering portrayal of Hearst, or more importantly, of Hearst's mistress, which Hearst was furious about when he found out about the film. Reports are he never saw the film, but he found out about it through his people, and Hearst did everything he could to stop that film from premiering and did everything he could to destroy Orson Welles' career. And while the film ultimately was shown in select theaters, it and was nominated for multiple Academy Awards, it basically didn't win those Academy Awards and was buried. And Hearst was successful in destroying Orson Welles' career. And then it was only years after the fact that Citizen Kane was released again. And at this point, film critics saw the great masterpiece that it was. So this is a little bit of the history that you will be watching in the battle over Citizen Kane, which again is approximately 40 minutes or so. So you can see that there's several sections here. And then again, if you wanted to see the documentary in its entirety, you certainly can, though you're not required to. And all of this will prepare you for viewing Citizen Kane next class. And today's attendance question, which will be due Wednesday on the 17th, and certainly if you need additional time, please let me know. But the idea is that hopefully you can complete the attendance question within 48 hours because your peers need to read all of the responses. You don't necessarily have to respond to your peers, though you're encouraged to do so, much like you would do in a face-to-face class. You're not required to participate, but you are encouraged to do so. But you are required to read all of their responses and my responses in turn. So as you can see that I've already responded to your introductions, and I will soon be responding to your thoughts about canon. Now, the question that you have is, after you've watched at least the selections that I have made for you on Citizen Kane, the battle over Citizen Kane, that 40 or so minutes. Again, you don't have to see the entire documentary. What was the most interesting thing you learned about the battle over Citizen Kane, and why? So I look forward to reading your responses. Notice there are no right or wrong answers here. It's opinion-based. Really more interested in your thinking. So with that said, I hope you're doing well. I'm doing well, and we will continue on next class with Citizen Kane. Take care. Bye-bye.